Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, well, honestly, today feels a little different.
It does.
Usually we're tackling, a specific event, a new piece of tech, but looking at the stack of documents we have on the table, we've got historical records, declassified CIA files. We're not just looking at an event, we are looking at a system.
It's a massive stack. And you're right, it's not about one isolated incident. It's about a continuous thread in foreign policy.
A thread that is so much longer and thicker than I expected. I mean, when we talk about the U.S. changing a foreign government, the whole regime change conversation, I think most of us picture the big, loud stuff.
Invasion, tanks rolling down the street.
Exactly. Operation Desert Storm. But the data you've pulled tells a much quieter and, frankly, a much, much busier story. I found this statistic in the reading that it stopped me cold. According to one study, just during the Cold War, the U.S. engaged in 64 covert and 6 overt attempts at regime change.
And that number is actually kind of conservative depending on how you define attempt. Oh yeah, if you broaden the scope to include interference in foreign elections, so funding candidates, dirty tricks, propaganda, the numbers just skyrocket. Between 1946 and 2000, we're looking at interventions in at least 81 foreign elections.
Wait, hold on. 81 elections. That is almost 2 a year, every single year for half a century. And we aren't just talking about a U.S. ambassador saying, hey, I like that guy, right? What does intervention actually look like?
It's rarely just a verbal endorsement. No, we're talking about funding specific opposition parties, giving them a financial edge, printing propaganda pamphlets, or in some cases, spreading disinformation to damage a frontrunner. It's about tilting the playing field before voters even show up.
So the mission for this deep dive is to get under the hood. We want to understand the mechanisms. How has the U.S. shaped governments for over a century? We're talking about the evolution from, old school annexations.
Literally just taking land.
Right, to what the classified files call clandestine activities.
Exactly. We need to move beyond the what happened, a coup happened in 1953, and look at the how. Because the toolbox is fascinating. It's a study of influence. Sometimes that influence looks like a Marine expeditionary force, but more often it looks like a suitcase of cash.
Or a radio transmitter broadcasting fake news.
Or a strategically induced truckers' strike. Yes.
It's like a MacGyver approach to geopolitics, but with much higher stakes. And looking at the timeline, I was so surprised this didn't start with the CIA. We tend to think of this as a Cold War invention, spooks and trench coats.
Oh, long before the CIA existed. The tools have evolved, from gunboats to algorithms, but the strategic desire to shape the political landscape to benefit U.S. interests, that's been consistent since the late 19th century.
Okay, so before we get into the history books, we need to define our terms. One of the key documents in our stack is a directive that actually defines clandestine activities. It feels like we should pin that down so we know what the playbook actually looks like.
It's a crucial definition because it outlines what we call the gray zone. This directive explicitly lists what falls under the umbrella of covert action. It includes, and I'm quoting here, propaganda, economic warfare, preventive direct action, including sabotage, demolition, and evacuation measures. Bridges, power plants, radio transmitters, anything to paralyze a functioning state, and it goes on. Subversion against hostile states, including assistance to underground resistance movements, guerrillas, and refugee liberation groups.
Assistance to underground resistance. That sounds so noble in a movie, but in practice that means arming and training insurgents to fight their own government.
Precisely. And here's the most important distinction the document makes. These operations are explicitly separated from armed conflict by recognized military forces.
So it's all about plausible deniability.
100%. If the Marines land, everyone knows the U.S. is there. If a bridge blows up in the middle of the night, or a rumor starts spreading that the president is insane, well, who can say for sure who did that?
It's gaslighting on a geopolitical scale.
That's a very modern way to put it, but yes.
So let's rewind to when things weren't so subtle. The imperial era. Our notes start us in Hawaii, 1893. Now, I know Hawaii wasn't always a state, it was a kingdom. But the mechanics of how it flipped, it wasn't a standard invasion, was it?
No, and this is a great example of how private interests often lead the charge. Hawaii was a recognized kingdom, but you had a group of sugar plantation owners, mostly Americans, who were upset. Queen Liliuokalani was looking to strengthen the monarchy and reduce foreign influence
So the sugar barons are worried about their profits.
and their political power.
Right.
So they formed something called the Committee of Safety.
The Committee of Safety. That sounds so bureaucratic for a group planning treason.
It's all about the branding. They orchestrated a coup backed by the unauthorized landing of U.S. Marines who were there ostensibly to protect American lives and property. They overthrew the Queen. But here's the catch. President Cleveland, who was in office, actually withdrew the Treaty of Annexation. He called the overthrow an act of war.
Wait, so the U.S. president said, this is illegal, but Hawaii still ended up American. How?
They waited him out. The Republic of Hawaii existed for a few years, essentially a waiting room for annexation. When President McKinley came in, who was much more expansionist, they passed the Newlands Resolution in 1898.
A different legal path.
Exactly. A joint resolution required fewer votes than a full treaty. It was a legal loop-de-loop. Create a fake government, wait for a friendly president, and then use a legislative shortcut.
That is crafty. But then you look at the Philippines right after the Spanish-American War, around 1899, and the mask comes off completely.
Oh, this one is just a massive bait and switch.
Yeah. The U.S. shows up to fight Spain, and the Filipino revolutionaries think, great, the Americans are here to help us get our independence.
That was the narrative. We are liberating you from the Spanish Empire. But once Spain was defeated, the U.S. signed the Treaty of Paris and bought the Philippines from Spain for $20 million. The revolutionaries were suddenly told, actually, you belong to us now.
Talk about a pivot. You go from being allies to shooting at each other.
And that turned into a brutal war against the First Philippine Republic. It was a clear message. The U.S. was a global power, and it intended to hold territory just like the European empires.
Which brings us to the Banana Wars. The notes mention Nicaragua in 1909. Now, usually when we hear about U.S. intervention in Latin America, we assume it's about fighting communism. But 1909, the Soviets aren't a thing yet. So what was the driver?
The driver was the Panama Canal. Or rather, the fear of a competitor to the Panama Canal. President Zelaya of Nicaragua was negotiating with Germany and Japan to build a second interoceanic canal through Nicaragua.
So if a second canal opens up, the U.S. loses its monopoly.
Its monopoly on shipping, on military movements, it was a threat. So the U.S. supported a rebellion led by a conservative rival, Juan Jose Estrada. The Marines landed again to protect American lives, and Zelaya was forced out.
And the new government, surprise, surprise,
signed a treaty giving the U.S. exclusive rights to build a canal in Nicaragua, rights the U.S. never intended to use. They just wanted to make sure no one else could.
That is incredibly cynical. It's like buying a patent just to bury it.
Strategic Primacy 101. But this brings us to the massive shift. World War II ends. You can't just sail a gunboat into a harbor and plant a flag anymore. It looks bad.
Plus, you have the Soviet Union with nukes. Direct conflict becomes very risky.
Exactly. We enter the Cold War. The strategy shifts to containment and the domino theory, the idea that if one country falls to communism, its neighbors will fall. This paranoia, combined with the inability to use overt force, gives birth to the golden age of covert action.
The era of the CIA. And the first big test case is Iran, 1953.
Yeah.
Operation Ajax. I think a lot of people know the headline, CIA overthrew the government. But the mechanics of how Kermit Roosevelt did this are wild.
It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. You had Prime Minister Mossadegh, democratically elected, very popular, but he nationalized the oil industry, kicking out the British. The U.S. was terrified he would drift toward the Soviets.
So Kermit Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt's grandson, goes to Tehran with a suitcase of cash. What does he actually do?
He manufactures chaos. The CIA hired mobs to stage protests pretending to be communists. They attacked mosques. They vandalized shops, all while shouting pro-Mossadegh slogans.
Hold on. They pretended to be the guys they were trying to overthrow.
Yes, it's a false flag. They wanted the religious leaders and the middle class to think if Mossadegh stays, these godless communists are going to take over. Then they hired other mobs to attack the first mobs. It created the illusion of a country spiraling into civil war.
That is so devious. You break the windows, then blame the homeowner for not keeping the neighborhood safe.
And it worked. The military stepped in to restore order, Mossadegh was arrested, and the Shah was reinstated as an absolute monarch. It wasn't until 2013 that the CIA officially admitted, yes, that was us.
And once they had that success, it seems like they thought, hey, this works. Because the very next year, 1954, we see almost the exact same playbook in Guatemala.
Operation PB Success. The name says it all. You had President Jacobo Arbenz. He wasn't a communist, but he was a land reformer. The problem was the biggest landowner was the United Fruit Company, which had massive ties to the Eisenhower administration.
So again, corporate interest meshes with Cold War paranoia.
Yeah.
He's taking our bananas, he must be a red.
Exactly. But the mechanic here that stands out is the use of radio. The CIA set up a clandestine radio station, the Voice of Liberation. They broadcasted reports of a massive rebel army invading. They played sound effects of battles that weren't happening.
So they basically gaslit an entire country into believing they were losing a war that hadn't even started.
Right. Arbenz panicked. He thought he was facing a massive invasion, when in reality, the rebel army was just a few hundred guys stuck near the border. He resigned.
It's incredible how effective that was. But if Iran and Guatemala were bloodless coups, relatively speaking, what happened in Indonesia in the 60s seems like the darkest chapter in this entire stack.
Indonesia is where the anti-communist drive turns into industrial-scale slaughter. This was 1965-66. The military, led by General Suharto, launched a purge of the PKI, the Indonesian Communist Party.
And we aren't talking about arresting leadership, we're talking about mass killings.
Estimates range from 500,000 to 1 million people killed. Civilians, teachers, union members, peasants. And the U.S. role here wasn't just, money or radio broadcasts. The source material is very specific. U.S. embassy officials provided the Indonesian army with kill lists.
Literally lists of names of people to be targeted.
Yes, thousands of names of alleged communists. And as the army killed them, they would report back to the U.S. officials who would, and this is the detail that just haunts me, they would physically check off the names on the list.
That is chilling. It turns a massacre into paperwork. Just sitting at a desk marking an X next to a human being knowing that X means they're dead.
It shows the extreme level of detachment. In Washington, this was viewed as a major success. But on the ground, it was a river of blood.
And that mindset that the ends justify the means carries right through to the 1970s. We used to talk about Chile in 1973. Nixon and Kissinger.
Right. Chile is interesting because it combines the economic warfare we defined earlier with military action. Salvador Allende was elected, the first Marxist president in a Latin American democracy. Nixon's order to the CIA was explicit: make the economy scream.
Make the economy scream. That is such a visceral quote. How do you even do that to a country?
You cut off international credit lines. You secretly fund opposition media to run constant stories about how incompetent the government is. And crucially, you fund strikes. The CIA helped finance a massive trucker strike that paralyzed the country's distribution of food and supplies.
You starve the country, make people miserable, and then say, see, socialism doesn't work.
You create the instability that justifies the coup. When General Pinochet finally took power, many middle-class Chileans were relieved because the chaos, which the U.S. helped manufacture, finally stopped.
And then they got 17 years of a brutal dictatorship. Moving into the 80s, we see the dirty wars continue. The Nicaragua example in our notes caught my eye because of the manual. This was literally a how-to guide for insurgents.
The Psychological Operations and Guerrilla War Manual. The CIA distributed this to the Contras, who were fighting the Sandinista government. It is a shocking document. It explicitly advises on the selective use of violence to neutralize government officials.
Neutralize being a euphemism for assassination.
Yes. And it talked about creating martyrs, taking a death and spinning it to incite anger. It was essentially a textbook on terrorism, funded and written by a U.S. intelligence agency.
And didn't the International Court of Justice actually call the U.S. out on this?
They did. In 1986, the World Court ruled that the U.S. had violated international law by mining Nicaragua's harbors and funding the Contras. They ordered reparations.
And the U.S. response?
They vetoed the enforcement resolution in the UN Security Council and ignored the court. It was a stark reminder. International law applies to everyone unless you are a superpower.
Now, while all this is happening, we have the Middle East. And this is where the story gets so complicated because the alliances shift so fast, they'll give you whiplash. The term for this is blowback.
Blowback is the perfect term, the unintended consequences. And Afghanistan is the ultimate example.
Operation Cyclone, 1979. The Soviets invade Afghanistan.
And the U.S. sees a golden opportunity to give the Soviet Union their own Vietnam, a costly, unwinnable war. So the CIA begins funneling billions in money and weapons to the Mujahideen fighters, routing it through Pakistan's intelligence service.
Yeah, we're talking about serious hardware, Stinger missiles, things like that.
The most sophisticated weaponry available. And it worked. The Soviets were bled dry, tactical victory. But who were we arming? We were arming religious extremists who flocked to the region to fight a holy war.
Including a wealthy Saudi national named Osama bin Laden.
Exactly. The infrastructure of training camps, supply lines, and international funding networks that the U.S. helped build to fight the Soviets, that became the foundation of al-Qaeda. We effectively trained and armed the people who would attack New York in 2001.
The tragic irony of the century. We created a monster to fight a monster. And that theme of friend today, enemy tomorrow shows up in Iraq too.
Oh, Iraq is a dizzying pivot. In 1963, there's evidence the CIA helped the Ba'ath Party, Saddam Hussein's party, hunt down communists. In the 80s, the U.S. supported Saddam in his war against Iran.
Because Iran was the new bad guy after their revolution.
Right, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But by 1990, Saddam invades Kuwait, and suddenly he is the new Hitler. Then in 2003, we invade Iraq to remove him. We spent 40 years helping build him up and then tearing him down.
It makes you wonder about the long-term vision. It feels like we are constantly reacting to the immediate threat.
That is the chronic flaw of covert action. It solves the headache you have today, but you rarely control what grows in the vacuum you create.
So, bringing this up to the present day. The Cold War is over. Did the playbook go into the shredder?
Not at all. The tools changed. You see less general in sunglasses seizing the radio station and more economic strangulation and support for NGOs. Look at Venezuela.
Right, the 2002 coup attempt against Hugo Chavez.
Opposition leaders met with U.S. officials repeatedly before the coup. The U.S. rushed to recognize the new government immediately, which was embarrassing when the coup collapsed 48 hours later.
And then more recently, 2019, the maximum pressure campaign.
Recognizing Juan Guaido as the legitimate president, even though he didn't hold the office. Seizing Venezuelan assets, sanctions on oil, the goal was explicit. Force the military to flip and oust Maduro. It didn't work.
It seems like the mechanics have limits. You can make an economy scream, but you can't always guarantee the political outcome. And we can't forget Haiti in 2004.
Jean-Bertrand Aristide.
And that one is still just shredded in fog.
The U.S. says he resigned. Aristide says U.S. soldiers came to his house, put him on a plane, and flew him to the Central African Republic against his will. He calls it a modern kidnapping.
Regardless of which version is true, the result was the same. A leader the U.S. disliked was removed.
Exactly.
So if we zoom out and look at this entire stack, from the sugar barons in Hawaii to the Stinger missiles in Afghanistan to oil sanctions in Venezuela, what is the big takeaway? We know how they do it now, but has it actually made the U.S. or the world safer?
That is the provocative question, isn't it? In the short term, often, yes. U.S. interests were protected, Soviet expansion was checked. But the long-term cost has been astronomical.
In terms of stability.
In terms of stability and trust. The intervention in Iran led directly to the 1979 revolution. The intervention in Afghanistan birthed global jihadist terror. The interventions in Latin America created deep-seated anti-American sentiment that defines the region's politics to this day.
So we are essentially trapping ourselves in a loop.
Yeah.
We intervene to fix a problem that was caused by a previous intervention.
We are kicking the can down the road. But every time we kick it, the can gets heavier and it's packed with more explosives. We trade a tactical success today for a strategic nightmare tomorrow.
Well,
Yeah.
that is a heavy thought to end on. I feel like I need to go look at photos of puppies or something.
I think a deep dive on the history of golden retrievers should be next on the list.
I am approving that topic immediately. Thank you for guiding us through the gray zone today.
My pleasure.
And thank you for listening. This has been The Deep Dive. Keep questioning the narrative, and we'll see you next time.